In the Module 6 for due diligence, I think we have addressed this during the previous lectures at the beginning, and then we mentioned it several times during the course of other lectures. But generally, at the start of the project, actually at the start of a project, what I mean by it is that when a client comes to you with an idea of a building in a specific, remember the word specific, site. That is really the key word, because someone might tell you, well, what is the regulations for a 10-story building? Well, there can be very many different things, but in different jurisdictions, in different locations, even though there might be a zone that allows it, but maybe design review board doesn't allow it. So a specific site is the key to it. And when I say specific, let's look at it. 1, location. 2, allowance. 3, regulations as to federal, state, and local. Which brings us well back to what I just started, and that was the due diligence. When a client does come to you with a specific idea for a specific site, and it will ask you whether this is possible or not, or it says, or she says, if we might want to proceed with this project, you are responsible as an architect, as a developer, as a design professional, and that includes the engineers, to verify all constraints that exist on a specific site. Now, when we list this, you need to go to the local governmental agencies, that is building, planning, and zoning, plus fire. You need to get the information from all of these organizations, which define for you the constraints. If I were to start the constraints, here are 1, zone for the site. What zone does this site falls under? Is this a residential, commercial? Some jurisdiction, including Los Angeles, has a CV, which means commercial variable, which means it's possible that you allow a mixed use. Or is it industrial? Which in an industrial zone you will not be able, for example, to build a residential. So these are all the items that you need to look at. 2, use of the building, proposed, and the zone of the site. That's what I was just telling you. For example, in an industrial area, you cannot build a residential condominium or apartment. Number 3, height limitation. Every zone has its own height limitation in the local area, and it needs to be verified with the local agencies. Because there might be, you might see one block in the street that the two properties might be next to each other, but one have been allowed to build 4 or 5 story, and the other one has not been allowed to build 4 or 5 stories, and you wonder why. Well, if you look into it, you will realize, for example, just as an example, that site falls under the flight corridor to an airport, and therefore they will not allow building more than 1 story, and that is the limit, where that other building happens to be on the other side of that flight corridor. So here's the height limitation. 4, setbacks. The setbacks, if this is your property, and I think we have talked about that plenty, there is a setback. And all of these are setbacks, which defines your buildable area. Setbacks plus buildable area. 5, FAR, which is the floor area ratio. Some jurisdictions will allow you 1.5 times of buildable area. Some twice, 2 times, some 3 times. Depends on every jurisdiction that you go. 5, context. When I say context, is this a historical and a preserved environment, or you're free to build any types of building? Context, design criteria. A lot of communities have set up design criteria. We are very DRBs, by DRBs, which are their design review boards. Certain communities will not allow certain types of buildings, all glass or modern. Some communities would dictate what it has to be, that the roof has to be covered with. And even though it doesn't seem to be correct, everyone is in charge of their own property, but at the same time, in some jurisdictions, you will find out that because of the context or because of the objection of the community, they will not allow buildings that will have, very contrasting character than the rest of the buildings that are within that community. So the context, and whether it is also a part of the historical preserved environment, or is it part of the design criteria system, what is that design review, what is the design criteria? So you do not embark on a project that is, you design it in a modern system, and then with the flat roof and the glass walls and everything else, and then you go back to design review, they said, well, where have you been all this time? We won't allow anything like this. So you need to do that from the beginning, because if you do so, then you need to redesign the project at your own dime. And that's not what you want to do. 7, parking requirements. A lot of times they ask you certain number of cars, number of stalls per X amount of square footage. For example, in certain jurisdiction, you need 4 cars, make it an example, 4 cars per every 1,000 square foot of retail, which is a pretty good criteria for designing shopping centers and malls. Some areas they require you 5, but you need to make sure that might make a major difference. You might have to go one more level below grade, and that is a lot of cost. Because remember, if, for example, the reason I bring it up, if you're above grade, a parking stall in a parking structure, that's how they count the cost of a parking structure, is per stall, is about $14,000 to $16,000 per stall. When you go below grade, that changes to 20 to 25,000, depending on where you are. So that makes a major difference. If you have 100 car that needs to be put in below grade, that means you need another level, and that 100 cars multiplied by this, that gets to you, get your budget $2.5 million more, and that can kill the job. So it's very important that you realize what your parking requirements are, where you locate them, how you spread them out in the site, and access. 8, let's say, is it in a coastal region, which then you have certain additional requirement that for projects that are located in coastal regions. For example, if, and I will draw this here, here's a section to a site, here's your property, here's the neighbor's property, and you both have an access to the road. This guy's building is situated here. The Coastal Commission who is in charge of the design of properties along the coast, we look at this and say, well, your building has to go this much high because you cannot possibly block the view of this guy while he was first here. Granted, you bought the property, but if you build above that, you're going to kill the value of his property out here because he will lose his view to the ocean. So since you're coming after him, you need to observe his presence there and build a project that is like this. Now, you might project some extent up, and that is a compromise with this, but you sure cannot completely come up and block his view, so you need to go through this process of approval. I will pick up in the next lecture.